Hello, everybody. This is free to play Shroom or F2P Shroom here from Eamon 1026 or Eamon 26, bringing you an evasion guide in particular. And a lot of players in the last week or so ask me about evasion. I think this is because a lot of people want to counter tanks and the sacred hunters and the sages. There's even a few necros that are starting to emerge that are putting a thorn in a lot of people's side. So figured that outlining evasion wouldn't be a bad thing, and trying to explain all the quirks of it in one concise video might be easier than people skimming through some of the larger guides or looking through some of the videos, some of the past videos or the written guides that are to come. But with evasion, it is very strong, both in PvP and PvE. In PvE, you could basically run it at any stage, but in PvP, you need to have it stacked up to a high point to use it. So this can be possible in the early game. You would just need to put all of your resources in and likely be a bigger spender or have some of the rush mounts early, like you want to have maybe the ghost back accessory, the ghost behind for the extra evasion. But if you aren't in the early game and you're in the later game, Evasion becomes a very good PvP set for tanks, and I've even seen some damage tilts use it. Like, I think I've seen two or three tamers with PAL crit evasion sets, and it's a pretty funky set. And again, most people aren't set up for it, so it can be pretty devastating if it's unexpected. So with this guide, I'm not going to give you the PAL crit evasion because I'm not as versed in that. I'll give you the evasion regen, but evasion regen could be used by any class. If you're a sage, if you're a necro or sacred hunter, you know, you're going to have a better advantage because these classes have a greater ability to tank, even a prophet, compared to a dark lord, a axe warrior, a beast tamer, etc. Boom. So with evasion, using evasion regen, the gear that you get is going to give you a substantial power boost. Like right now in this set, I am 119 million. In my other sets, I'm 180 to 190 million. So, 20, 30 free million power just for using evasion regen. And that's just because it's calculated very funky in the way it's put into the combat power ratings. But with evasion, there are a few things to note. So, like stun is good against archers, evasion has its quirks, it's good niche usage. So you have the potential to evade basic attacks. And evading a basic attack allows you to evade the enemy combo or the enemy stun, I think even launch. I think that also triggers on basic attack, if I'm not mistaken. So evasion could be rather useful for things that the enemy's going to hit you with, and it's also going to work on things like counter strike. So even though that requires you to hit the enemy, when they go to hit you back, you can dodge or evade the counter strike. And when that happens, basically, you're going to negate the damage that's being outputted, which is very, very useful, especially if you're versing sages, or a warrior. But then again, with the basic attack things, it's super good against Necro, the class that I play, or Sacred Hunter. Where you'll run into some issues is your mages, your beast tamers, and your archers. So mages are easy. Mages skills and skills will always hit through evasion. So I tend to run my evasion builds with higher skill damage res just for that point. I don't want some smaller mage that I'm not prepared for in the slightest, just running up on me and destroying me. Even a larger mage, I would hope I'm trying to stop them, especially something in parking with the debuff. That's usually where I like to have my fun. So going past mage, you have tamer and or like beast tamer and archer, and they work very similarly. So during both of their class skill, they get complete ignore evasion. So even if you had was an evasion, they would completely ignore it. And for Tamer, that's for their pals, for their damage sources. And for Archer, it's the actual player. So also their clone, if I'm not mistaken. It's a summon. And those three or four, because Dark Mage is Dark Lord and Prophet, but more Prophet than Dark Lord. So those three or four classes are really what's going to give you a lot of issues. Now, people could also stack Ignore Evasion, and that's the other part that comes into question is, as you are making an evasion build and you start beating people, they're going to make ignore evasion builds. So this is also where you'll start to notice, oh, I need to get more evasion, or oh, I need to have something more than evasion to cover my build, so I'm not dying to whatever player. I'll show you what I use on top of evasion, but I think a good place to explain this now is probably here. So, how evasion actually works in battle is you have your evasion stat, right? So, let's scroll down. We have my evasion stat at 249. My ignore evasion is about 103. So, if you were to subtract those, it's 146, not including the decimal because I'm a bit lazy. 100, yeah, 146. Mm, And that if you then take that number and you were to raise it to the zero point 0.9 power, so one of the little carrots at the zero point 0.9, um, it'll give you your true, let's call it your true evasion stat. So your evasion difference, your evasion minus your opponent ignore evasion is not what your actual evasion stat is. That stat is then lowered by this extra modifier, let's say, and that is raising it to the zero point 0.9. If you don't want to do any math, simply around 130, if I'm not mistaken, evasion difference is the maximum cap of 80% evasion. So you can only have a maximum quote unquote true evasion of 80%. And that's again with that 130 difference between your evasion and your opponent's ignore evasion. So by reversing an opponent with my ignore evasion, I would have 146 and I would be fine, or 145 in a decimal, but I'd be fine. If I had, only 149 evasion, then I would have 36. Then you raise that to the zero point 0.9, it's even less than 36. And now you're starting to have even less ability to evade. So moving forward with that, if you're wondering how you should get this evasion, I would do it in steps. So the way I would do it is I would get it on your gear first and foremost. I would try to get some evasion regen gear. Then I would go to your artifact runes, saving up the runestone restore and the runestone block potions, those green and red potions, to try to force all of the upgrades onto evasion. So when you put all the upgrades onto evasion, basically you're going to almost, if not over, get a complete set of evasion gear because evasion is going to give you 70%, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, no, 50% from the gear, my bad. So you're going to get 50% from the gear, and then you can get well over 50% from the artifact runes here. As you see, I have 80% or near 80. Now, the third place I would say to get it, and this completely depends where you are in the game. If you're later in the game and you have more artifacts, and you have more back accessory divine feathers, yeah, divine feather coins, you might completely invest in evasion from the get-go. If you're someone who doesn't have these divine feather coins, maybe you're a lower spender who didn't have the dark lord, the dark privilege pass thingy, or you are free to play, or you're in a earlier server, you might not have nearly as much access to, you know, creating this tree. And in that case, you might want to lightly invest in the evasion here. But you can get it, as you see, on all these top nodes. There's always evasion on the left side. There's also evasion on the left side of Beast Tamer and the left side of Archer. So you have the four on the top, and each of these can total to 20%. So you have 20, 40, 60, 80, and then you can get another 20% here for 120%, if I'm not mistaken, max accessory. Don't have that if you're wondering and you just saw. It's because I don't have enough feather coins to get it all. But those are some of the things I'm ironing out, as the days go on, get more resources, spend them as you go. Now, if you're still lacking, there are some extra places. So we talked about earlier with the ghost behind in the rush shop. There's also some other, spender event gear. If we were to go to this one, the Dawn Warwing, this one's also going to give you evasion. However, you might not want to get your evasion from here if you can afford something else. I like to use the Titan's Hold to reduce the enemy attack because I like my defense build. I know some people like the bit gateway, and then there's some people who like some other option. Then you also have I don't know if any of the artifacts give evasion. I would have to click through all these, and I don't really. Well, I'm just trying to be really quick. But I know the mounts. There are a few that do. So there is the speed of death. Think there is another one if you end up checking on through, but I might be mistaken. But this one is one of the most commonly used on an evasion build just because it has cleanse. So like your Nebular Shuttle or like your Phoenix bite, like your Phoenix mount. Where is it? There she is. So like this Phoenix, it also has the cleanse, and all of these are basically going to allow you to undo or remove the status effects that the enemy applies to you, which is often very good when the enemy hits you with their class skill, reducing your res, or they hit you with some kind of debuff. It's very nice to be able to clear it, which the cleanse does nicely. There are some things you can't cleanse, and that's becoming a little more popular with some of the more recent event gear. So maybe cleanse will fall off a little bit, but this is usually what I use. If you're wondering why it doesn't say use, it's because I've been playing with this, Leo, just because it fits very nicely into my defense build. And I've noticed that I'm able to tank a little better with Leo against especially some builds compared to when I was using my Beat of Death. Where else, if you're asking? So you have some things like there's some the Crazy Rider Guardian will give it. You could also get it on the remold. So yeah, this one has it here. So in the tornado icon, you can get it up to 5.1. I would say the earlier methods I showed before, your gear, your rune, your artifact runes, and your back accessory should be the main three places you pump it. And then anywhere else should kind of be A, if you're trying to verse an anti-evasion build, like someone using very high ignore evasion, or if you don't have evasion built up to begin with. So, besides the Guardian and the different remold, you also have the Star Guardian. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's the girl. This one? This. Yeah, so this is going to reduce their ignore evasion. You could use this realistically. There is it this one? Yes. So this one for the shield, you can get more evasion. I don't use shield effects, so this is not what I have been using, but you could very easily get this. And for 5 seconds, when some of the faster shields are like, there's a 14 second is the fastest, if I'm not mistaken. So every 14 seconds for 5 seconds, only off for 9 seconds, not a bad deal. But again, these are things I would go auxiliary wise. You also have divining. I go for my ignore crit here, but you could easily have evasion here. You can get it up to 9% on the top. You go to the world path less, so 9% on the top path, 6% on the world, and then what is here? Uh, Nothing. So 9% and 6%. I think there are probably some other places you can get it from and just draw a little bit of a link right now. Oh, the PAL. So there is the Evasion PAL here, Mona. Now, if you weren't around for this event, I don't know if this event was going to come back. It says event, not collab, so who's to say? But for right now, it can come back. And if you don't have it, I apologize. But if you do, this is another 10 or 12% if you play Necro. If you're wondering, the deploy effects are always better as Necro, promise. Mm, yeah. But now moving into kind of how I think you should play it. Evasion regen is great. Like I said, it's Necro, Sage, Hunter, even some of the other classes if you're using no speeding. I use the Thorn Spore to reduce their class skill. Again, this is reducing the amount of time that an archer or a tamer has complete ignore evasion. So if you're limiting that, it's quite helpful. Same with the scroll artifact. Some people, I don't have that one, but a lot of people would use it on an evasion build just because it does the same thing. You could reduce the active skill duration by up to 40%. And so if you're reducing it by 40% or whatever it is, and then plus this, and then you could have no speeding on top of it, you could reduce their ability to have most of their damage output and only basically give them a very small window for them to do any damage. Um, Now, again, there is that evasion cap of 80%. So evasion isn't as perfect as it used to be. It used to be able to fully evade every single hit, and it was perfect. But they put the evasion cap on, and because of that, now you need some other form of sustain. So for my build that I'm showing you here, I use ignore crit and high defense, and then skill damage res and skill damage res. Skill damage res because most of the larger players that I try to stop are usually tamers. Bara when he's destroying our lot. So if I'm gonna try to stay down low in a lot and try to stall him with a lot of debuff, more often than not, I'm gonna have a decent amount of pal damage res or just use a anti-pal set, which isn't this one. This is more of my anti-sword, anti-sacred hunter, but also something I use for general cases. So, mm, like I said, high pal damage res, you have the high skill damage res. Again, mages will obliterate you. So I tend to run skill damage res here. And then I have minimum reses in here, just so I can try to be as tanky as possible. Also using the book, every little bit counts in the end. And then my souls, you get the extra 5% on a lot of the places if you reroll your souls constantly, or if you're like me and you make multiple pink souls so that you could have different res type. Like one of these will be combo, one of these will be counter, one of these will be whatever. Like this is skill damage, basic attack. uh, But yeah, to me, I think having those two reses is best. Inner damage res, I think, would be second to pal damage res, just because you'll notice that some axes are still able to tear through you if they full stack ignore evasion, and you're guarding in skill damage res, not high crit res. Some axes will do a lot of damage. So, I'd say PAL damage res, and then second best is usually what I go with is counter damage res. And then because there's so few plumes nowadays, I don't tend to use combo res. Then, like I said, I use high ignore crit. So my divining is pretty much completely set up to be ignore crit. There is some ignore combo, and I'd probably love for it to be more ignore combo, but I've just been trying to stack ignore crit as high as possible. I have 70% right now, or right under it. And that is also from the Guardian. While these aren't great by any stretch of the imagination, and I'll probably never use this crit, they're more than nothing. Hopefully you get a red ignore crit, red ignore crit, but got some blues and some purples, which are better than some greens, so I will not complain. Moving on. Mhm. And then high defense. But I think everyone who has found me by now knows I love my defense. As you see down here, I run 13.6 billion defense. If you look at my bonuses, they're very skewed towards defense. And if you're wondering, I like it. I think it's useful. Think you can do a lot with a defense build, but I think you need to full tilt defense. I have defense on Avian in three places, hopefully fourth if I don't get no speeding there. It on my soul fully. I have it on my uh, artifact scrolls, even though this is definitely not a great alignment. More often than not, I'm just trying to defense. Now, there are times I'd be smarter and I'd put this 190, 185, raise the HP, raise the attack. But for this set, it's mainly just trying to. And more often than not, the more defense I have, the better. Especially for the few cases I get to two, three, very occasionally four debuff in parking. I'd rather have a super high amount of defense. And I know once I max this at 200, I could finally start doing these without worrying about sacrificing anything of defensive value. If you're wondering for the skills I use in this class, is this is the full stalling class. Just trying to tank. If I wasn't trying to blade pierce, and Dragonic Resonance would likely be in there. Mm, 100 slashes is amazing if you're like me and you have very weak attack. If we were to go back to this set, my attack is 3.5 billion. It's worse than like a free to play right now. So, like at the server age, free to play, not a new age server. But because of that, this avian giving me the 10% attack, and then the 100 slashes, if you choose to use it, is very, very helpful. For the same reasons, most people end up using the Ascension. So 45 seconds in, you get the attack boost, and then some people use temporal compression. Because this is a stall build, like I said, there are times I debate getting rid of my Ascension and having, just like I have here, no temporal compression and having no damage. But I haven't done that in a little bit because I only tend to do that in cross showdown when I really just want to be annoying and stall someone for 13 minutes. So lower my attack or as low as I can, I suppose, or the greatest, reducing I can. And then I increase defense, and then sometimes I don't even touch HP. I just touch crit res or another stat just to try to have that as tanky as possible. But yeah, so this is kind of what I've been using. Now, if you aren't a tank and you aren't defense build, this is been kind of explaining my defensive evasion build and how I think evasion fits in everything. You aren't using a defensive evasion build. What you can use is HP focused evasion build, which is far more, you could do far more damage with it. Most people that do it, especially if you're playing Necro, but even a lot of sages and hunters would be using something like this Deity of Purrs to stack a bunch of healing triggers just to do a bunch of HP damage, and then having really high HP and keeping their HP very high. They can keep doing 4% of their current HP to the enemies. Also, why Necro, Sage, and Sacred Hunter get a bit of advantage here is because even without building any stats and just having a high enough attack, Martial Sage has its class skill, which each counter strike does HP damage. Sacred Hunter has its class passive, where is it? Your basic attacks deal HP damage, and then you could also have the raised attack if you do end up doing something funky like crit regen or crit evasion, maybe. But Green Spirit is similar to Sage, and we have it on our class skill for our PAL combos and PAL attacks. Mm. So basically, what I was trying to explain with this is that these three classes can use evasion regen the best. mm, and still have a decent offense because of the fact that they have something built into their class that does damage naturally. So the rest of their things could be more towards sustain or even doing more damage to try to kill something like a regen. I've heard a lot of Supreme Spirits and Sacred Hunters going after regens, especially sages in the last few weeks. So, and I've even heard of some sages hunting down sage. So I definitely think you can make very strong builds without even putting much of a just focus on your output of HP damage if you are one of those classes, especially if you're if you play Sage and you use counter regen, you could use punch counter on your ABM. There's a million tricks in the book depending on exactly which way you're going with it, but it's all going to depend. So when you have enough evasion, I think it's worth noting that you really want to have somewhere else of sustain. So, a lot of people like this motorbike because besides the evasion, it's also going to give you the damage res, it gives you recovering HP, increased attack, my favorite, increased defense, but also the energy regen speed and everything else. This is really helpful in addition to that cleanse, mm, and is why it's one of the most popular. Again, it's what I used for the longest time. Gives you 20% evasion, so it's perfect with your evasion build. But recently, this Leo has been what I've been playing with, and honestly, I've been enjoying it greatly. And then if you didn't have those, obviously your Phoenix is a great option, like I said before, or your Nebular Shuttle. Um, and with those, you're allowing your res to be a little high. There was one other thing I wanted to make a note of. Oh, it's the affect here. So if you were lucky enough to be around for or if you're lucky enough to breed a good avian, or if you're lucky enough to be around for the B Duck collab. In B Duck, you have the ability to crossbreed, so you could crossbreed these things. Mm, But on the other collab avians, you're kind of just stuck with only getting it on them. Oh, you can't even get it on them. Didn't know that. So only on B Duck, it seems, is there terminal strikes and lightning conductor. If I'm not mistaken. Mm, And those are. Sorry, I'm just double checking right now. Give y'all false advice. But because of that, those are two extremely strong attributes if you have access to them. And if you're wondering what makes them so strong, Lightning Conductor is the ability to reduce enemy crit damage. I've heard of some people actually loving this on their avians. This was a long time ago. I haven't seen as many people run this as much. But then Terminal Strikes is what many people use because it gives that scissor artifact effect where it's reducing their regen and their healing amount for 1 second, but it has a chance of triggering every basic attack. And then basically you deal so many basic attacks, and it is constantly activating. And even if it's not always activating, it just being there is far. If you want to make an anti-regen set, I know some people even do it on evasion regen. Terminal strikes might be something that you really want to play with. But yeah, I think this has been the evasion build and pretty much all that I use on my evasion build. Quickly, roll through all the pieces so that if you're curious, you could see. Again, this is particularly made to stall, so most of it is reducing all of its damage to then tank. But in a lot of my other sets of damage, um, they still have a lot of defense, but they have at least some damage set up. They have the ability to usually kill, especially with a damage tilt who doesn't have regen. If it is a regen user, you're really going to want that Deity of Purrs Avian, like we talked about earlier, with, a lot of people want that with terminal strikes and no speeding and everything else, and then they pump up their healing triggers. But if you want to play a tanky like me, and you just want to kill damage tilts and everybody else, and sometimes even stall the damage tilts because they have too much defense nowadays, then this is what I run. Mhm. Nothing too complicated. I do use Litho or Lithio or whatever you want to call it. This spirit, the defense one, mm, just because it gives me more defense. However, most people are going to likely have gone with Tide, and that's not a bad option. As again we said that you want something besides evasion. Tide giving you all those ignores first. That's Zephyr. So Tide giving you all those ignores, ignore combo, ignore crit, the heal, increasing final damage res, etc., is all going to be super helpful for also allowing you to have some form of sustain. Again, shields, great, but shields are broken by mage, evasion against mage. And if you're running into mages or mages are blowing up your evasion set, you might not want shield here. This is because the general set, so shield is there. Yeah, I think that was my evasion build. Hope it could behoove anybody. I made some adjustments since my past video with some things in the back accessory. Like I think it used to be up for stun and then going right. I realized that this endless outburst, while it's 90% of the time useless for me, the very few times that I do drop below 20%, it actually has saved my life a couple times by activating Blitz and everything else. And then, my Leo kicks back up and reduces their attack, and they had to start taking no damage again. So swapped it from this useless stun to this sometimes useful endless outburst. Again, temporal compressions is definitely the most useful of these three for a tank. That's evasion regen. It's just that I wanted the extra energy regen and I wanted the defense and the res. Another thing I also wanted was the skill regen triggers in case I end up building a deity, just because this is one of the places you would the heal triggers. So you can get it in the skill regen, you can get it in the POW regen, and then if I'm not mistaken, you can use multiple windows to get the first, not I think it's quad terrain, yeah, terrain. So every basic attack and combo has a chance to restore your HP. It's another healing trigger, and you could use a bunch of more things to get a heal you. Just you can't use a different avian, obviously, because you need to use deity for its ability. Damage, healing. But yeah, I think that was everything. Hope that could behoove anybody. Mm, If it wasn't helpful, or if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments or on Discord. I know some people also DM me on Discord. That is fine. But if it is your first time DMing me, it can get lost in a flood of notifications. Guys. But I will try to be mindful in looking through the notification request. And then if I don't catch your DM, it's usually easiest to just ping me in either the player guide section, which has my Necro guide, or just in the global chat, at 2P Shroom. Teach me defense. Think of that note. And I usually speak pretty fast. But yeah, this is my evasion build. Those are the adjustments I would make if I didn't have certain gear and if I was in different stages of the game. But till then, what I plan to do is as people get more ignore evasion, which they're going to, but getting it in more areas. So I'm probably not going to get it in the Guardian because I like Divine here. I like my ignore crit here. And even in divining, I kind of like my ignore crit here. However, if I can save and reroll, which I have a lot of the save and reroll currency. I have 2,300 of it because I've never spent any. Mm. Then I'm gonna try to work for, maybe some evasion and also ignore combo, ignore counter, etc. Maybe block, inspire, power res, something of that nature. Mm. And then if I really need it, I could always swap this to a shield-based build and get a shield. It reduce the enemies. We showed that before with was this one, reducing the enemy ignore evasion. So there are ways to definitely work around an enemy using an ignore evasion build because you're stacking evasion and they're stacking ignore evasion. Very hard to be the person stacking evasion because you need to keep 130% higher than your enemy to be at the max evasion usage or efficiency, whatever you want to call it. So I would definitely worry if you were the evasion side. I'm always kind of in terms of that. I got very quickly ahead by having my runes done. But since that, I really haven't done anything besides in my back accessory. I used to have it over 300% evasion. I had like 320, I think, in divining. but they put a cap for the 80% and it becomes less viable. So it's reduced my evasion. But again, I'll get away pretty well with my 50. Sometimes I run 275. Sometimes I run 20. 220 is extremely low for my mission and legends and elite when I forget to use my tickets. But in if you're lower, 220 might be amazing for you. 190 in the early game would be amazing. So it's really just going to depend. You get that evasion bike early, you might be leaps and bounds. But yeah, I hope that could behoove anybody. That is my direction on where I want to build it. Not those two places, but if I need it in the past, I can get it there. Need it a little more divining. I'm gonna in a little more back accessory, polish those off, and then I could always get it for hero. And if I really need it, divining and remold. But remold again, these slots really kind of just wasting ignore crit and ignore combo. 8% ignore crit or ignore combo for they're in different slots. Actually, okay, so that will be something. 5% crit rate's gonna go down the drain real quick. So, I'll get evasion in these slots. And I did so that it was the hurricane icon earlier. Oops. So I'll be getting evasion in those slots, but it's not gonna be the first thing I trace by any stretch. I'm gonna go ignore crit, go for maybe the blitz or the pow or the damage res, and then just because I don't really. But if people have crazy high ignore evasion, yeah, we'll move into it earlier. Yeah, I hope this could behoove any of y'all. Been free to play.